Morning everybody, how you doing today? On this episode of the show, we're going to talk about your web browser and privacy. Now, in a recent episode of Recode Decode with Kara Swisher, she spoke to Gabe Weinberg. He's the CEO and founder of DuckDuckGo, a very popular privacy-focused search engine. And the topic of their conversation was online search, online privacy, social networks. They kind of just went all over the place, but really focusing around privacy. And I thought it was really, really interesting. And there was a few terms that popped up in this conversation that I've heard in common usage around that I'm not quite sure people truly actually understand. And I wanted to cover those here because they're directly related to cybersecurity and to privacy. And I think even just general users, it's really important that people are extremely clear on what these things mean. So the first term that Gabe and Kara are talking about is opt-in versus opt-out. Now this one, I hope everybody already gets, but I want to cover it just to make sure. So opting into something means actively making a choice to enable something. So in the context of privacy and web browsing, it's actively enabling location features, right? Opting out is the exact opposite. Something is on by default and you need to actively make a choice or find a preference or flip a switch to get out of it. So great example is location. By default, location sits in between both of these things. Sites can ask for your location on Safari on macOS Mojave, but you have to confirm that you're going to be able to grant it. So by default, the service is on, but each website you need to opt in for 24 hours. That's a decision where it's both opt-in and opt-out, which is an interesting example, and the reason why I brought it up because you can actually go into your settings in Safari and turn off location services, period, and just say, no, they're off. You can't enable them. But by default, the feature is on, and then each individual site you need to opt in for. And that's a reasonable balance. The capability is there and sites can individually prompt you, but it might not be the right balance for you. So knowing that that's there is absolutely critical. A really bad example or common example that I feel is negative is probably a better way to say it, is the vast majority of insurance contracts have opting, at least here in Canada, have that your default gets sent, your information by default gets sent to the US for processing, and it's basically offshoring your data, and there's a whole bunch of other things that you agree to by default unless you opt out. Now you have to find that in your contract. You need to then actually jump through the hoops to opt out of these things. That's bad because they know that, hey, some people might want this behavior, but they are going to make it hard to get there. So that's the concept of opting in and opting out. Is it on by default and people have to remove themselves, or is it off by default and people have to explicitly opt in? When it comes to privacy, that's a critical difference. My feeling is the general rule is that you should be opting into things that touch your privacy. So anything where it's going to be sharing your information out, you need to be opting in, and there should be rules around how often you can actually ask people and prompt them and basically nag them to opt in if they're choosing not to. But I think that's absolutely critical. Opt in versus opt out. Now, another one is the do not track feature in your web browser. Now, most web browsers have this feature. It's a simple checkbox that says, do not track me with other websites. Now, most people believe that once you turn this on, you're no longer tracked. The difference is it has no teeth. Zero, nothing, nada, does nothing. Basically, all do not track does is sends an extra bit of information with your web request that says, I'd prefer not to be tracked, please. It's you raising your hand. And again, depending on what browser you're using, this is either opted in or opted out. It's on by default or it's off by default. But even if it's on, it's a feature that bothers me because it's one that should be a great feature. But it really, because it has no teeth, it just gives you the idea that you've done something. I've done something. What have I done? I've made sure that I'm not tracked. I've said, do not track me. The reality is you're simply raising your hand and say, I'd prefer not to be tracked, and then it's the website's responsibility to respect that header, and for every user that has that option and has raised their hand, to actually not track them. So again, do not track doesn't actually really do anything. Don't rely on it for your privacy. An ad blocker or just an outbound firewall that prevents any access to a bunch of these tracking sites is far more effective. And the last area I wanted to talk about that came up in this Recode Decode episode, which you should really check out because it's a great conversation between Gabe and Kara, is incognito or private browsing mode. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've talked to people who are like, yeah, no, I just browse with private and it's great. Nobody can see what I'm doing. That is not how private browsing works. Private browsing or incognito mode within your browser allows you to open up a new window. Even on mobile this works. It opens up a new window, normally coded differently, colored differently, so you can understand that you're in a different mode. And what it does is it doesn't cache anything locally, including cookies, and it doesn't keep history. So there's no local browser history. So a lot of the time, you'll see that joke where like, oh, I better go clear my browser history. Private mode doesn't keep a browser history. That does nothing to hide the activity from the server side. So the server still sees your IP request. It still sees some browser metrics. They can still, somewhat track activity. They won't be able to cookie you and track you across, but it's not foolproof. It is more of a local defense. There's a lot of holes. It's better than nothing. But again, there's a lot of holes in private or incognito mode browsing. It's not what people assume, which is like, oh, I turn this on and nobody knows what I'm doing. It will prevent local artifacts for the most part, but if you download files, they're still downloaded. It's just going to prevent those behind the scenes caching and cookies. So 3 major concepts here sort of ramping up. Do not track, doesn't really do anything. Incognito and private mode just stops a history really from being built. Everything else is still on for tracking on the website. And opt-in versus opt-out, which is by far the most critical concept. But these 3 things popped up in this conversation, and I thought it was really important just to kind of reiterate them here so that everybody is reminded of what they actually truly mean. And if you're building technology, please make it opt-in. For the most part, if anything touches privacy, it definitely should be opt-in. Opt-out for other things. So a common, just to hit this nail on the head yet again, a very common thing that I see on apps is that by default, it sends very detailed usage metrics back to the application creator. Those should be opt-in. They should not be opt-out, simply because that information can be pretty sensitive sometimes, and it's aggregate data that really makes privacy challenging, but it's also something that's definitely worth spending your time on as a user, as well as a builder of technology. So what do you think? Let me know. Hit me up online at marknca, in the comments down below, and as always by email, me@markn.ca. I hope you are set up for a fantastic day. Look forward to talking to you about this online, and we'll see you in the next episode of the show.